today I'm going to talk about digital responders. And what I'd ask you to do is think about, I've been listening to people talk about programs and tools and products and platforms, but let's pull back a little bit and let's talk about what does it mean to be a volunteer? And what does that participation mean? And so I think most volunteers were driven by a sense of matter. Now, all of us have very different definitions of matter, and that might depend on our family structure, our financial situation, and certainly I think it's a real gift if somebody has some time to volunteer in their community, either in person or online. And so when I say online and volunteering, sometimes we only have just a little bit of time in our busy lives. My sister's got 3 kids. She said, Heather, I've got half an hour to do some digital volunteering a month. So make it work for me. And I thought that was the most valuable thing. And I think this is where people in our lives become our teachers in that regard. And so, well, I don't expect everyone to take their volunteering and turn it into a career and move to another continent like I did. I do think that we needed to right-size it in the way that communities work and the way that volunteers work. And so this is a map of some volunteers who volunteered after the Nepal earthquake. And in fact, digital volunteers who volunteered via social media, online platforms during the Nepal earthquake, we have math that we say there was about 19,000 of us. Now that's because the tools and the products and the communities are at a nascent stage. We don't have the metrics and the stats to calculate how many people have done what. And I can tell you right now, I'm more than certain that far more many people volunteered their skills or maybe shared something so that it funded an NGO. And so this particular map is of a community that I work with called Micromappers at Qatar Computing Research Institute. And there was 2,800 people who volunteered. And they did microtasking. That means that they tagged images, they tagged videos, they tagged text, and they said, this matters, this is important. And that tagged information, over 500,000 bits of detail, was then aggregated to a smaller amount, and that data insights was given to the UN, as well as 250 other aid organizations to help them with their information package. Because when an emergency happens, there's information overload. And so 6 years ago, I became one of these people. And now I work in Qatar, and I'm interested in how do we create more software and more tools to help people get involved with technology in their world. And so you'll see, this is a research project that my colleague Nora did on folks. And so if they didn't mask their IP or use a proxy, we found that the majority of these people are in the northern regions of the world. Well, I want to flip that map around. I love that we're talking about London, we're talking about smart cities, but my mission is to try and flip that map around because the greatest population is the youth population, and they have mobile phones, and they don't live in Canada, where I'm from. And so we were able to also ascertain that we think that there's a relationship between us getting in the BBC and the Guardian and more volunteers. More to be done in terms of who these volunteers are. But I want to dream a little bit bigger. I want to think about our cities and what we've learned from the humanitarian response and how we can help our neighbors. And so I looked for the biggest problems that I could find, and thank goodness the UN and 195 countries decided, you know what, let's create the Sustainable Development Goals. So the global goals are 17 kind of top-level goals, and these are really serious, kind of big, wicked problems. Everything from climate action, which I think is super important. I'm going to kind of give a reference to what I think digital responders can do with that, to partnership. And so I ask you in partnership, what can we build and what can we make to help people get involved in the world with some of these things? And the good news is that it's not just a bunch of lofty goals. They've created indicators and metrics and KPIs underneath it, which makes me happy because I'm interested in software. And I actually think those are nice goals, but what are we going to do with it? What does that mean? And when we announced these, they created something called the Great Big Lesson. They wanted to put these global goals in every classroom around the world. And so the Great Big Lesson was about sharing curriculum across all these different communities around the world. And then this website and the shared curriculum, I'm like, fantastic, what next? What next? Because those are nice goals, and I'm glad that you brought it to the classroom, but what does implementation look like? Again, I'm a tech, so what does implementation look like? I'm like, oh yeah, that's our job. Fantastic, so now we have a mission. So back to what I do in Qatar. So again, I'm interested in microtasking. So how can we make it a small bit? You've got 30 minutes, you're at the car wash, you have your phone. Can I tag some images? And so we created something called Micromappers, which allows people to make quick decisions. It's tagged by 3 people. This uses Pybosa software, which is free open source software. Tagged by 3 to 5 people. That way we can actually make sure that the data gets to quality level. But when we think about cities, so while I'm working on emergencies, my colleagues over in the urban informatics team, they're interested in how can we add social media layers to sensor layers, and how can we make a data layer cake of citizen information to be able to help our city. And so again, I live in Doha, Qatar, the Middle East. Lots of phones, lots of mobile activity. People are sharing about traffic, they're sharing about infrastructure. This city is changing all the time. And it's a very complex society. And we're interested in how do we kind of take what we've learned from humanitarian work and bring it back to the city. So back to these digital volunteers. I'm going to give you kind of 3 examples. Now, I'm part of Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. These are people who give their skills using maps as being part of the larger OpenStreetMap community. We have a tool called the Task Manager. I love the Task Manager. It's a small bit, gives you a tile, tells you to trace it. That's a little simplistic, and I think that just for the purpose of today, that's how much I'm going to explain about OpenStreetMap. But I'm going to give you 3 examples of how this applies to the city and the future. First, from Nepal. After the first 2 hours after the earthquake, I had sent an email about 20 minutes after the earthquake, because Nauma, who's my fellow board member on Humanitarian OpenStreetMap, they're part of Katmandu Living Labs. And Katmandu Living Labs is a large open source community, OpenStreetMap community in Nepal. In fact, they've been mapping in Nepal and building civic solutions for their community for about 3.5 years. We did hear back from him, but in the meantime, my colleague from the Philippines started preparing because we've been through this rodeo before. It's been 6 years, these digital volunteers. We know what to prepare. And so we got ready with our pre-disaster imagery. And people started to say, okay, what isn't mapped yet that they're going to need? Where's the epicenter? Then, once Nauma and his team got online and their office was decimated, they worked in a parking lot. You can see the wires coming there. They directed the global community as surge support. They have local knowledge, local culture, local relationships. They told us, hey, we need this. And so in partnership, 9,000 of us stood behind Katmandu Living Labs and gave surge support. They said, hey, you know what? We need to know, because the Nepal Civil Defense and Nepal Red Cross said, we need to know where the helicopter pads are. A pilot got onto our mailing list and taught us how to identify helicopter pads. In addition to that, they said, you know what, we need more help with the buildings. Well, the Katmandu Living Labs had created a guide a couple years ago on how to identify buildings, because buildings are different in every country. The infrastructure, how it's set up, is different. And so we're interested in learning how to help from their point of view. So the Japanese community translated that into Japanese because that's one resilient community helping another community. So here we have it, partnerships with NGOs, partnerships with governments. Number 2, Uganda. HotWorks in Uganda, we work with, we're thankful for the Gates Foundation, and we're interested in financial inclusion. And so I was very excited to hear everyone talk about crowdfunding and microfinance yesterday, because I think what's happening in Uganda, what's happening in other places that you might not come to the first mind, that's where it's going to get really exciting, because they're skipping the bank. They're going right down to the kiosk here where you can top up your card, where you can top up your phone. And so we're mapping that. And so again, the Ugandan community is driving that. They're telling us, hey, surge support, hey, community around the world, help us with this specific impact topic. Item number 3, and again, this is with banks. Item number 3, in Dar es Salaam, Humanitarian OpenStreetMap is working on a World Bank project with city planners and with the universities. And we're mapping flood risk zones. And so the city planners are right there with the mappers. They're going with field papers and they're uploading it to the internet, and they're asking us, the global community, to help them. So we have 3 different topics. We have policy people in governments and NGOs, we have banks, and we have city planners. That's the future of the cities. So these digital communities, in the last 6 years, I've been involved in quite a few of these. I'm part of what's called the Digital Humanitarian Network. I think that these digital skills that we're hearing right now, these are skills that can be used for city building. These are skills that we can use to tackle some of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. But I think we need to kind of really think about who's volunteering on what, and how do we make it easier for them to incorporate it into their day. And so, yes, absolutely, the organizations, the NGOs need to build the programs around it. They need to make sure that it's impactful, that people are not wasting social capital by volunteering on something that doesn't actually need to be done, that they're actually asking the right ask. And I changed my whole career to do that. So I think that when we're thinking about volunteers, and I've been sharing this with community managers, and I created this about 3 years ago, this idea that we need to create things from the things that people want to do. So they have a little bit of time, they have more time, they have a large time. So we need to do it over time, but we also need to think about what skills they have, what things they like to do, what tasks they like to do, and what do they want to learn. And so these are really hard aspects of it. So in my opinion, when I see people creating communities, if they're not thinking about it from the user point of view, they're perhaps making a mistake. So I said, okay, great, I have all these lofty ideas of digital communities, and I moved to the Middle East. I'm like, okay, let's see how this works here in Doha, Qatar. Now, Qatar is a very small country. There's only 2 million people there. And I work as part of Qatar Foundation. And so what I found was some allies. I'm working with the Qatar Red Crescent, and a community called Reach Out to Asia. Now, the Qatar Red Crescent is part of the whole IFRC, the whole Red Cross, Red Crescent community around the world. And Reach Out to Asia is a smaller NGO that focuses on 16 to 26-year-olds. And they said, great ideas, Heather, come and test with us. And so I'm trying to figure out how do we build these processes around it. And so I'm working in a community that I don't know very much about, and frankly, they're my teachers. And so the Qatar Red Crescent, you can see Rima here. She's got 2 sat phones, she's got an iPhone. That's what a humanitarian's life looks like. They need information, they need it fast, but they also need it to their phone. So what data bits are you going to give them? What's the just-in-time information? And so I ran classes for here's some digital skills, here's how you can incorporate it into the workflow. And they said, great. At their disaster management camp, they said, great. Now let's have workshops every month with the local community. Let's invite the entrepreneurs to come. And so we have entrepreneurs, researchers where I work, and humanitarians working together. Now with Reach Out to Asia, I partnered with UNDP, which is the United Nations Development Program. And this is a table full of women on one side, men are on the other side. And we're trying to tackle design thinking around the Sustainable Development Goals. This is Goal 7, affordable energy. Thinking about how to design communities online and offline and stitch them together. The most important thing you need to do is think about local culture, local language, and local knowledge. And frankly, these women, they can't go anywhere without a family member. And they play a lot of games. My colleague is writing this amazing research around games in the Middle East and women. Well, we need to kind of think about how do we incorporate the attribute of social learning and social sharing and digital volunteering, and not just have it in North America, but have it elsewhere. So a lot of people talk about digital learning as a stepladder. And I think absolutely, crowdsourcing communities need to have onboarding. We need to think about what are the skills that people can do. But I think it's a little bit more chaotic than a stepladder. I think people learn bits and pieces here. Like today, I was telling Robin Chase that I'm going to have to go back and rewrite a proposal based on her conversation today. So I mean, that's where we learn and that's where we grow. But I think that we also need to think about some of the barriers. And when I talk about digital volunteers, I'm very mindful of the fact that it's about access. It could be about privacy, it could be about education, it could be about the fact that some people just don't have food. And so with Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, we make sure that people get paid to volunteer map, right? They might map a bit, but they get paid in the field in the countries. People who volunteer globally, we don't. And I think what's important about that is that, you start to think about what are the social entrepreneurships that people could create around digital volunteering, and what are the ways that we can make it a little bit easier for people to get involved. So I have 4 kind of modest proposals for what I think the road forward looks like for crowdsourcing and digital volunteers. And when I think about digital volunteers, again, I want you to really think about this. It's not just about the humanitarian space. I really want to aim at some of the other communities out there and kind of in partnership kind of think about these little tenements of community and think about what else we can do inside of our topics of interest. And so I think we need to get discovery a little bit better. What are the things I can do today? What can I volunteer on? I think there's lots of tools out there that are maybe perhaps branding permission. And don't get me wrong, I think branding is important because people need to eat, but at the same time, you still need to think about discovery. Now, I don't know if you know the tool Hipmunk, but I'm a huge Hipmunk fan. And Hipmunk allows you to be able to aggregate where your flights are via a bunch of different companies, via a bunch of different ways to kind of engage. So for example, over time and location, etc. But we haven't made volunteering a search attribute. We've thought about it from our platforms and our organizations, but we haven't thought about it, well, I've got 30 minutes and I'm interested in climate change. What are the tasks I need to do? And of course, people are going to discover, you know what, I only want to volunteer for Oxfam. I understand that. And in fact, that's how we discover volunteer activities. But when you ask what else, we have to kind of think about presenting a little bit better. I think there's some tools to be made there. And in my talk with Robin, she said, Heather, marketplace. I'm like, yes, of course. I got it. I think that matchmaking, this is where it's on the NGOs. I think they have to figure out how to kind of have a task manager for their work. When I talk to them, they're like, hey, Heather, great thing about digital skills. I don't even know how to incorporate that because I can't hire a sysadmin. I don't have the money for that. What are the tools that we can make it easier for people, smaller NGOs, to matchmake? Now, don't get me wrong, the American Red Cross and Doctors Without Borders, they've got this going on, and we've been working with them in Humanitarian OpenStreetMap very closely about this matchmaking. But what about the other groups out there that want to volunteer in a digital way? And again, remember, there's parents out there that can't leave house at 6 o'clock at night because their kids are sleeping. What can they do with their volunteer time instead of television? We've got to fit it into people's lives. So I think there's a curriculum to be written around humanitarian response. And so my colleagues and I in June, we're going to be at the Humanitarian Tech Conference. And we've got a table of contents. I've already got it published online. And we're going to take a stab at those digital skills and the kind of community building around it and write the curriculum of what we've learned. Because I think that in terms of crowdsourcing, if we had an open handbook on how we do this, a recipe book, if I could borrow my thing from the guy from Things, we need a little bit of help around that. But I think the one thing that I think that is also gapping out is who's going to mentor that. And I think about Chris Skinner yesterday when he was talking about banks and reshaping banks. I think that we need to take a stab at, when we're thinking about crowdsourcing and all these kind of problems that we're working on, who can support it from an intellectual point of view? What skills don't we have at the table? And how do we stitch together the discover, the matchmaking, the skill building, and the mentors? Because I can tell you right now, I have a LinkedIn says that I want to be part of boards. I've had it for 3 years. I'm on 2 boards, but no one's ever contacted me, even though I'm on stages and I'm talking about it. And so this is not a vanity thing. I'm like, why aren't people getting engaged in that? So I want to kind of give you a couple of thoughts to close with. So each of us is building our own programs and our projects and our tools and our software, and we have all these call to action. But what are the open tools that we can make to help the call to action reach more people? Because right now I'm talking about 19,000 people that I know of from our tools that were involved in the Nepal earthquake. Well, if we look at all those wicked problems that I was talking about earlier, will you go back? Yeah. If we look at all of these, that's a whole world, and what are we doing? This is our world. We're responsible for it. And I think when we start to think about like how we could potentially make a difference on all these different topics using crowdsourcing, that's on us. And so we're all early adopters. And this is why I'm thankful that EPI has brought us here and all of the people from Crowdsourcing Week. Because in the end, you know, what we build today and we build with people, that's going to be pretty powerful. Now, I had this opportunity when I worked at Ushahidi to really see how people could create open tools and get people involved. And it was just, it's only 6 years old, 7 years old, Ushahidi is. And so this idea, Ushahidi is a tool that aggregates social media and mobile and tech and allows people to answer, what do I see, what do I hear? And so when I hear people talk about social sharing, what I think that they constantly miss is the program and the plan around that. And they're always interested in throwing shiny tools at it, which is fine. I love my shiny tools, don't get me wrong. I'm super excited to have sensors everywhere, but the biggest sensors that we have are each other. And I think that if we start to think about what those attributes look like and start thinking about who are those leaders, those ambassadors in other countries that we can work with, that's where it gets exciting. And so while I live in a very complex country and I'm trying to do something and I don't speak Arabic, my dream is that they're the leaders, right? That they're leading crowdsourcing, because in the end, we're a small population in Europe and in North America. The bigger population, wow. What happens when we start to really think about crowdsourcing tools from that angle? Thank you very much.